Hello, hello.
Hi, Happy New Year.
I know. Happy New Year to you as well. How you doing?
I'm good and stressed and excited and all of that. It's weird. It's like, I think a lot of people are feeling this, right? But like you get through the holidays and there's just all this like buzz and excitement and then it's just like, whew, back to work. Like there's still a lot to do, but it's a different busy. And I kind of love the busy that's like you get to leave work early and because work is quieter, but you get to see family and friends. So, it's a different feeling. And I'd love for us to spend some time talking about that today. Is just like what is the transition like for people and like how do we manage when things just feel kind of different or off or we're feeling kind of blah. But that's my life. How about yours, Chris? Tell me about your holidays and how you
Yeah,
feel.
no, I had a good time. I had a good Christmas Eve and Christmas. I got Greek food on Christmas, so we're always happy when we had Greek food. And then I had New Year's Eve with a good friend of mine up in LA, so I had a good time. And then spent some time with family on New Year's Day. So yeah, no, I'm excited. I mean, obviously, I know we have a lot of questions and we'll get a lot of live, but I think the topic today is an interesting and important one because I know for me, like when I was really, really struggling, and this is when I hear from a lot of clients, it's like it's the new year. I'm supposed to start off the new year with good thoughts, or I have to do certain rituals before the year crosses, or people being really, really excited about using the new year to kind of propel their treatment. Other people feeling like down, maybe they didn't get as much done in last year with treatment. So I think just a good overall conversation, maybe just from clinical and personal experience of just like what does the new year mean to a lot of people, and how I think the biggest thing I want to get from today is like how can we like embrace the newness of the year to really kind of like jumpstart recovery. So if somebody's like really wanting that, what can they do? How can they utilize that?
And I love that like Katie, one of our lead advocates, and so many others are talking about these like compassionate commitments too. And so it was so funny because I really do have like health as, I mean, I know so many people do, but I have health as a goal for me right now, just because with kids and life, I just haven't focused on that. And I want to focus on just feeling better and getting back to myself. And yesterday I was in my car, like just chowing hot Cheetos. And I was to January 3rd. And but it was so funny because I have such a different perspective now on these goals of like I was like, yeah, I'm eating hot Cheetos and like I had a great lunch and I'm having a healthy dinner and I'm like still gonna try to go on a walk tomorrow. And so it's how can we also like set these goals that jumpstart us and get us excited, but we don't hold ourselves to this level of perfection, that
Mm.
isn't always realistic and that makes you feel really crappy when like you've done so much good but then you focus on the like one bad thing, right? Versus looking at the bigger picture and setting these overall goals. And I think that's just like a lesson learned for OCD, right? Is that sometimes things are so black and white. And I don't know if you experience this, but I find all the time that a lot of my patients will come to treatment and they'll say like, Liz, I didn't get this done, I didn't get that done, and here's where I struggled, and I always have to pause and be like, so can we also talk about what we did accomplish and like what we did get done and talk about all the great things you overcame? And it's like, oh, okay, yeah, but those aren't that important. It's like, wait, no, those are actually much more important. And so I also want to push that like this new year, yes, let's set goals, yes, let's use it as an opportunity to kind of invigorate ourselves and like create good things we're excited for in the upcoming year. And let's give ourselves compassion to not fulfill things perfectly and to make mistakes along the way and to actually give ourselves room to learn from those mistakes and allow them to be like healthy learning versus these kind of negative consequences. Does that make sense?
No, totally. I think I can say forever, my thinking was black and white, not recognizing that OCD had such an influence. And I felt that way, especially dealing with perfectionism. Always things had to be done 100%, or I just sat on the bench. I didn't even try. And so the reason that's dangerous, especially with setting some specific and tangible short-term and then long-term goals for the new year, if you find yourself all or nothing thinking, if you don't hit that goal right away, well, first of all, people typically make goals that are hard to even achieve when you have perfectionism or all or nothing thinking. And then the second that you don't achieve it to the level that you would like, it's like, oh, got to give up. Might as well start again. So, one thing I asked my groups, I have a group Tuesday, Wednesday night. So last night, and then I'll ask tonight, we were talking about like, what are some of your specific OCD recovery goals and how can you make those happen? And then what are your general overall wellness and well-being goals and how can you make that happen? Because I think it's important not only to identify what you need to be in a really good mindset to really fight back against the OCD, but how are you going to go about it tangibly so it doesn't just feel like a pipe dream? It
Yeah.
feels like you have some goals or some kind of like ways to get there.
Yeah, I call that my greater good worksheet, and I actually make my patients fill it out all the time, and I just actually gave it to one today. But it's this like little worksheet that I have that I made that's super simple, right? But the goal, the point of it is that at the very top, I ask you to put your greater good statement. And so the greater good statement is something like, I want to fight my OCD so that I can regain relationships and friendships and, go to church freely or whatever. And then I ask you to list short-term goals. So like, what are the specific short-term goals you want to achieve within 6 months, long-term goals within 5 years? And then the ways that OCD interferes with these goals. So that is like general categories. So that could be like script, your short-term goal might be like, enrolling in classes. Your long-term goal might be having a career. And so the way OCD might interfere with this might be like scrupulosity or contamination, but this is like the themes. And then I ask my patients to write the top 10 OCD symptoms that you need to address to meet these goals. And the reason I really love this, like, it's the simplest worksheet that I just put together, but the reason I love it is it just kind of, like you were saying, Chris, it allows us to like be specific and to see the big picture and to be specific and hone in on like what needs to be addressed. But the reality is that you're going to be way more motivated to work on these top 10 OCD symptoms first if they directly impact these big picture things that are important to you. And right, versus just like, if I pick something of like, okay, Chris, today we're going to do contamination exposures. And you're like, fine. But like, I don't see the same value in those as doing scrupulosity exposures. Cause like, I want to get back to church this weekend, or I want to get back to church this year, or my Bible study or whatever. Right. And so anyway, I think the piece we're saying is that before we even think about ERP and what to do, we really want you guys to set greater good goals, to think ahead as like, what do I want? What is OCD taken away from me? What am I hopeful about? Or what can I be hopeful about? And set those, right? Set those first, and then start to think about how you're going to strategically approach OCD. Because the reality is that if your goal in the morning when you wake up is like, oh, today I'm going to do ERP just to fight my OCD, that's going to be super daunting and exhausting. But if it's like, I'm going to fight OCD today because I want that relationship back, or I want that career, I want to get back to school, right? We have these bigger picture goals. Now we're willing to do the hard work, to feel the anxiety, to feel the distress that's going to come along with it all.
Yeah, it was a conversation we had yesterday. I mean, I always let the client guide the treatment. I asked them, that was really the goal of last night's exercise was, I want to hear, what is it that you really want for your life? Like, what do you see going for you? What would make you really happy or start to feel like you're moving in direction? I always, I think I don't get the question asked a lot, but like sometimes people will ask me like, Chris, what do you think the point of life is? And I really think we all are given a certain set of skills and talents and interests. And it's really to nourish those. Because I don't know about you, but I know with me, when I feel like I'm nourishing all different parts of who I am as a person, I feel the most alive, the most happy, the most motivated. So what I like to do is let that guide the treatment. So asking people like, what is it that you really want this year? So if somebody says, you know what, I really miss driving my car to places, the freedom that gives, and I've stopped driving because of my intrusive thoughts around hitting people with a car, or being reckless, or like crashing into something. It's good because it sets a why. And I think we all need that for treatment, because obviously if you get yourself back in the car, the OCD is going to attack you. That's just what it does. And we need to learn how to respond differently. But what motivates us to do that is, like you said, having a reason. So that's a challenge I'm going to put for everybody in the chat watching right now, while Liz and I kind of talk about this for a little bit, is like, what are some of your goals for the new year? They don't have to necessarily be resolutions, but what are some OCD treatment goals? Or if you're kind of lost on those recovery goals, what are some things, like Liz was saying, that you really want back in your life that OCD is sort of taken away or making harder? Or what are just some general wellness? What are some things, like I always talk to clients, is there something in your life that when you do, you feel overall better? So if somebody says, yes, if I sleep a full 8 hours, I just can manage the OCD better and do the treatment, then that should be a wellness goal for 2023. So definitely in the chat, what are some of your goals? What are some of your recovery goals? What are some of the things you hope for your life in 2023?
100%. And I will also say, just to kind of add in an extra, one of the things for this exercise is I want you to think about, what has OCD taken away from me? What are the areas of my life OCD has impacted or has changed? Or that if I didn't have OCD, I would do different, and then transition that to a goal, right? If you're like, well, I don't know, it's like, okay, well, let's think about the areas OCD is impacted and the impact it's had, or the things it's taken away, and make that your goal, right? Your goal often is going to be things like, I want to live freely. I had a patient once who their greater good goal was, I don't want to live a half life to OCD. And I don't want OCD to make decisions for me. And it's like, that's the goal, right? Is that across the board, I want to be able to do whatever I want to do. I want to make decisions Liz wants to make, not decisions that OCD is making for me. So, all right, Chris. So my head has been kind of spinning since yesterday. Chris and I had like an awesome meeting with Jeff Shermansky, and we were talking about different stuff, but we really got on treatment. We were talking about treatment for a long time. And I don't know if you felt this, but like I was so invigorated by the conversation. And by the way, everyone, Jeff is the executive director of the foundation. If you don't know him, he's amazing. He's incredible. And Chris and I told him that he's required to join us for a live stream soon. So he'll be on in the next few weeks or months for sure with us. And that'll be so exciting because he's just such a wealth of knowledge. But I feel like I took so much away from our conversation. So we were talking a little bit, just to give people background on, and this is just going to be like a candid conversation between Chris and I that y'all will hear our opinions, but we're talking about ERP and new treatment modalities and, you know, how individuals with OCD navigate what treatment to get, what treatment not to get. But we were also talking a lot about ERP in a nutshell, of like the negative perceptions people have of ERP right now and kind of the bad rap that ERP might get. And I would love, Chris, actually for us to spend a few minutes just like talking about that and breaking it down. But I also would love to hear from y'all. So I would love if in the comments, you guys can write kind of your thoughts on ERP, whether they're good, bad, but like if you have negative thoughts, like what are those negative thoughts? What are some of the things that make you, or that you've heard make other people be not interested or turned off by ERP? Because it's really important for us. One of the things we were talking about that I loved is it's just so critical for us as a community to sit down and to really say, hey, what are people feeling and thinking? And how do we either dispel those myths or come up with alternatives or help people understand there's lots of options? Because I don't ever want someone to feel like, hey, ERP looks a certain way and it's the only thing that's going to work. And if you don't want to do it, there's not a treatment for you. It's like, no. Like, let's talk about why it didn't work or what didn't work about it or what scares you about it. And can it be done differently? But also, what should ERP actually look like? That is my goal for this new year, is that anyone who watches our streams is able to walk away really understanding and feeling like they understand what treatment should look like, what the expected outcomes from treatment are, and what treatment should not look like. I think that's really important. And Chris, I don't know if you have other goals of what you want to set as your goal for the new year for these streams.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is what we were talking about yesterday is it's hard because one thing that I think as a clinician with lived experience, I always come in mindset with is I know how much better people's lives will be once they do the treatment. One of the things that I have a conversation with a lot of my clients as they're concluding treatment, and I like to focus kind of on the whole person, but one thing I get a lot is just they're lost. They don't know who they are. Their identity has been so wrapped up into OCD. And there's a lot of sadness and pain as they get better because they look back and they're like, man, I've missed out on so much of my life. And so my goal as a clinician, as doing these live streams, is always to show you, and obviously with Liz and all these others that come on these live streams, is like we are walking testimonies to promise you that the treatment works. But one of the things, like Liz was saying, when I talk to people about, hey, what's your hesitation? Because to me, you know, if I have a bad cough, I'm going to run to the doctors, right? If I have a headache and a migraine that continues, I'm going to go to the doctors. If I'm feeling weak, I'm going to go to the lab. But for some reason, people with OCD aren't rushing to treatment all the time. Other barriers, obviously, but even if there aren't certain like financial or location barriers. So when I talk to people, I love to engage in conversations. A recent conversation with a mom, she said, well, my son looked up online and he thinks that the treatment is going to be licking a bunch of toilets and he's just refusing to do that. So he doesn't want to get better. And that always breaks my heart because I went through treatment and one of my subtypes was contamination. And my therapist and I never talked about licking toilets because I didn't see value in that. But what I did see value in was being able to go to public locations, sit down at restaurants, go to public restrooms, because it was preventing me from making friends and leaving the house for a longer period of time because I had to drive close to my house so I could rush home and use my own restroom. I couldn't stay in the night in other people's homes, so I couldn't stay on vacation or stay with, you know, friends' houses. So what I always want people to know is that's not the treatment. What the treatment is really teaching you how to do. And Jeff was talking about that yesterday and all the work that John Abramowitz has done about learning. I think of the therapy as teaching you a new language, and this new language is really kind of reconnecting with what matters most, and all the error messages and all the freakouts that your brain and body teaches you as you're engaging in those things that matter, such as driving, public restroom, going back to church, are error messages trying to get you to be safe, but it's you teaching your brain, I am safe. I don't need to do all these compulsions and safety behaviors. So when I work with clients, I'm really finding out what are the things you want back. Let's go do it together. I'll help you with the tools. And I don't see people leaving because they're like, I don't want to lick toilet seats. So I think that's the big thing, is just dispel the online rumors that I think prevent a lot of people from doing treatment.
Yeah, and the other piece I'll say too is I want everyone to remember that treatment is progressive, right? So we aren't, if you have a goal of, I don't know anything about fitness, and Tom does, so we should have him on. But if you have a goal to bench press, I don't know, 150 pounds, you don't start with 150 pounds, right? You slowly work your way up. And in fact, starting with the highest number your goal is would potentially get you hurt. It would be kind of dangerous, and it wouldn't be recommended. It would set you, there's a potential for it to really set you back. Treatment's the same way. So not only do we not need to be doing outlandish exposures or exposures that don't make sense or that are illogical, but even exposures that are for you, we don't start with your highest, hardest ones. So when people will say things like, well, I don't want to come to treatment because I'm nervous you're going to make me do, you're going to make me go do blank, 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 or I'm going to have to hug my mom and I haven't hugged her in 10 years and I can't do that. It's like, yes, that's an eventual goal, but we don't start with that, right? We're going to work our way up to that. If a patient could start with their hardest exposures, they wouldn't be coming to treatment. None of us like OCD. We don't like our intrusive thoughts. We don't like the rituals. If we could face them even at the highest level, we would do that on our own. We're coming because we need that support. We need guidance, and we need to work our way up to it, right? And so I think that's really important to know too, is that treatment should kind of scare you. You should be a little skeptical because we are going to do things different than the way you're doing it, right? That's what's going to give you your life back. We're not going to want or encourage you to keep doing what you've been doing because that will keep you stuck in your OCD. But the process in which we get your life back shouldn't be grueling. Chris talks about how it shouldn't be fear factor, and it should be something that actually we kind of have fun along the way, right? ERP can be fun and it can be exciting, and most importantly, it builds so much resilience and pride in yourself. And that's what I just love to be a part of and love to watch that journey with other individuals. The second piece that's just so critical when we think about these live streams, the education, the content, like all the stuff y'all are getting from them and our overall goal is, what are you learning? It isn't really about, do you know how to do ERP for this coffee cup being contaminated? Like, yeah, that's great that if I could say that and know how to do it, but it's across the board. Have we learned how to change our relationship with OCD? Have we learned how to change our relationship with anxiety? Do we understand the ways that we inadvertently give anxiety and OCD power? And do we understand how we could take away the power from OCD and anxiety? Right? It's critical for us to think of things as like this push and pull, right? The more you try to push against OCD and resist it, so resist thinking about the thoughts, resist thinking about the fear, the more it's going to push against you. And it's going to keep trying to push back and push you down. Versus if you actually approach it, it wipes away, right? It doesn't really have freedom, versus like I'm one and one out. And the second is that if we ritualize, we give it more power too, right? So we want to learn across the board. It's not about a specific trigger. It's about across the board. Are we learning the ways that we feed anxiety, that we feed OCD? Are we learning what we're telling our body? Right? There is a physiological response with OCD. There's messages that your brain is sending. Your brain is sending messages that this is dangerous, and our behaviors actually confirm that there's danger. They confirm to ourselves that there's danger. We have to change our behavior to unconfirm that, right? To be able to say, actually, like, you're telling me this is dangerous, but this isn't dangerous. This is a false alarm. And we want to respond as if it's a false alarm, and we know that, instead of as if it's a real alarm and we need to be panicking. Because when we panic and respond as if it's real, we're telling OCD that you are dangerous, we are afraid of you, and we should be afraid of you. What we want to do instead is, like, when we have fears that OCD is dangerous, we want to respond with like, hey, you're not dangerous and I'm not afraid of you. And I'm not going to respond to you as if you're a threat or you're dangerous.
Yeah, one good talk that I saw at the conference, the online conference, Fred Penzel did a talk about getting in your overall mindset. And what I talked to a lot of clients about, and one thing that I sometimes feel like I do differently than maybe some therapists that aren't like specifically just OCD specialists. So clients that will come to me after seeing maybe a therapist that treats a lot of different things is they're really good at the behavioral component, but they're not always understanding the mindset. And what I always tell people is the mindset is so important. So for this new year, right, we have to be in the right mindset to get better. So when I kind of felt, I think we all have these stories when we go through treatment. I was kind of doing the treatment, I was sort of engaging here and there, but when my mindset was like eye on the prize goal, that's what really clicked for me, and that's what made the treatment work. And I think a big part of it for me was just wanting my old life back. I was pretty happy with some of the aspects before the OCD really hit, but it was overall a mindset of just not like these separate little exposures anymore. It was recognizing like the bigger picture and realizing like, okay, every single time I do these certain things that are important to me. So I had harm thoughts around family. So I already knew when I went to a Christmas event, I was going to have a lot of anxiety, but I kind of went and prepared, and my mindset was clear. And I had an overall treatment philosophy of, I am trying to get back as much of my life, and I'm ready for it. I'm ready for OCD. I know what tricks it's going to use. It's going to give me feelings in my body that I'm going to mistake as attraction. It's going to have thoughts telling me you shouldn't be around these family members. You might like them, or sometimes the opposite, you might hurt them. I already know that's going to show up. But if my overall treatment mentality is to get my life back, to really engage in that, to push through, I was in that kind of very strong lifestyle, and that's what helped my mindset. So I think that's the other thing I work with people too, is it's more than just doing the work. It's understanding the overall purpose of the treatment so that you can get your life back, and you start to get almost like a pro in how to handle it.
It's not about just like, let's face your fears to make you miserable. It's let's face your fears to get you back to your life, right? These greater good goals, that's why we started with them. Like, they're so critical because they're the only thing that's going to drive our willingness to feel the discomfort, right? It's this bigger picture. The second thing you just said, Chris, that I loved is you said, when I may go see family members, I know that these thoughts might come up, and I might have these thoughts and they might be there. And just even the way you're saying it and talking about it, it's really clear that you approached it with this mentality of like, you're probably going to be there, and like, come on, bring it on type of thing. Versus if you would have said something like, yeah, like I decided to go see my family, live by my values. And like, I just was committed that like, I'm not going to have the thoughts and I don't want them to be there. And I'm right. If we're kind of like, I'm going to go and I can't have these, they can't be there, stronger chance they're going to be there, and they're going to be really loud, and they're going to be popping up. But actually, if we just kind of let them and welcome them, stronger chance that you're going to be able to be present, and they're not going to be able to win. Right. So again, the more we suppress our thoughts, the stronger they become. The more we engage in compulsions, the more confused we get. So
Absolutely.
I love this kind of just not basic, but like going back to the basics of OCD and ERP, because I think it's really important for us to do.
For you personally, what are some of your wellness goals? Like just for your general, because I think everybody always talks about like physical health, or they talk about like money and finances. But I think, you and I are in a unique situation that we're impacted by our mental health probably more than like our friends and family who don't have any of these, right? So what for you is kind of like either an overall OCD or general like mental health well-being?
Yeah, I think for me, my biggest goal is that I want to take time for myself. And I don't really care what that is, like whether it's going to a Pilates class on occasion, which I used to love and haven't been to in years since having kids, because I've just made that like the last priority, or reading a book. Like I love to read and I haven't read, and I have a book sitting on my nightstand. So I don't really care what it is, but my biggest goal is like giving myself permission to take time for me. Because in this season of life with 2 young kiddos and being at McLean and being so busy, I feel like I put myself last. And so that's really my biggest goal across the board. I will say that I've done a really good job of therapy, something I'm consistently in. I consistently kind of work on my OCD and, those sort of things. But I think for me, not needed, because I have to practice it, right? I can say it, but I have to practice it. Giving myself permission and not letting guilt win of like, oh, but I could be answering those emails, or I could be at work, or I could be with my kids if I have free time. It's like, yes, I'm not going to go spend 10 hours of free time by myself because that's not reasonable. But even if it's 20 minutes and I need to do a mindful walk, or I want to read a little bit, like giving myself permission to make time for me.
I like that. That's important.
What about you?
I was really inspired by a talk that I did. I did it with actually Tommy, my mom, who's a registered dietitian, and then a person that I know in my personal life she's a yoga instructor and also mindfulness and mental health. And it was really impactful doing the research for the talk and just looking at how much that kind of stuff really impacts your mental health. And we obviously know that eating a certain diet isn't going to eradicate OCD thoughts. But the research we were doing, it just shows that somebody, like if there's two twins, right, and one of them isn't taking care of their overall wellness, the OCD treatment is going to be a lot harder. But somebody that's finding foods and mental health and sleep and mindfulness and exercise as part of their just general well-being, what happens is their overall stress hormones are reduced, and then it's a lot easier to not get into your fight or flight. Because I always talk to clients, like, once we're in our fight or flight, it's a lot harder to eradicate the OCD because we're just so in it, right? Especially if it's a new trigger or an unexpected trigger. So as much as we can do the treatment on our own and be proactive, we get good at putting ourselves in those situations. But an overall wellness can help you not get as intense. So I think that's just for me, is like looking at certain things. Like, I did martial arts after treatment and I did a lot of mindfulness. And obviously, I don't feel like mindfulness is necessarily a treatment for OCD. But what I learned is, like, when I was in the present and really engaging and not in the past or the future, OCD's voice was weaker. So really incorporating that. Exercise is a great way to burn off overall stress hormones and stress and anxiety. And so just looking at ways that I can better my general overall mental health, because both you and I are busy, right? And we're doing so many things and we love what we do. And if I don't have that kind of like plug-in of my phone at night, like, figuratively, of myself, I'm not going to be the best everything I'm going to be. So it's just making sure that all those other elements in my life are handled, so that although I will have stress and anxiety, we all do, right? But I'll be better able to manage it if I'm taking care of those other things, versus just like white knuckling it and hoping that I'll get through it with Starbucks and and a prayer, right?
Yeah, no, I do love my Starbucks though.
Yeah,
Your face earlier, because my coffee I drank turned freezing cold, and I was like, that was disgusting.
yeah.
But yeah, no, I love it, right? It's really about, what do we know? Like, when we get quiet, what are some things we need? And I will tell you, actually, COVID was such a blessing for me in many ways, just because it was the first time I was required to get really quiet in a long time. I had been really afraid, actually, of being quiet, because when I'm quiet, my OCD is louder. And it really made me like stop and address kind of remaining OCD stuff and be able to be quiet, because there was nothing else to do except be quiet, right? During a lot of it, you were spending way more time at home. You were not able to go do a lot of stuff. And I was someone who like rarely spent time at home, was always on the go. And so for me, there were some blessings in that. Like, I feel like I learned a lot about like what I need and what's important. So,
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I'm fortunate in a place where I am in my life with the OCD and the BDD managed. And I always tell everybody I'm not cured. There's no such thing, but I'm in a really good place with recovery and I have strong tools. Depression is something that runs really heavy in my family. And so I think that's the thing that I always have to manage. And I know for me personally, like an example of one thing I always talk to clients is, I do a lot of, towards the end of treatment, do a lot of like, presentations to my clients, especially if they come to group, about different ways as you transition out of treatment to make sure your overall wellness is really positive. And during the pandemic, I had to isolate, and I'm a very outgoing, engaging person. I'm an extrovert. And I know for me, that kind of set me into a low level depression. It was really hard to like live alone and be alone. So I think that's one thing for me too, is I know, and I try to teach every client, like, know yourself. And that's what I want everybody on the live. Know yourself. If you're somebody that, if you get really poor sleep, your intrusive thoughts or your compulsions are worse the next day, that's something you want to manage. I have clients that always ask me about alcohol and marijuana usage. And I ask them, how does it impact you? And they're like, well, after a night of drinking, my scrupulosity thoughts are 10 times worse. And it's like, okay, maybe that's something you have to work on managing. So I know for me, making sure I'm always prioritizing like spending time with people and engaging with people is something that keeps the depression in check. So I think that's important too, is like starting to know what works for you and what doesn't work for you, so you could best take care of your wellness. And it sounds like for you, Liz, like just knowing that you need to have some you time. It doesn't need to be grandiose where you're like jetting off somewhere by yourself in some foreign land, but just as long as you're kind of getting some of that time, that's what helps you just really be in a better mental health space. I know for me, I have to, or else the depression creeps back. So
yeah, and it's hard to create it, right? It's hard. I think we can always justify why we don't make time for it, but we have to. And I think we have to give ourselves permission to ask for help. I struggle a lot with that, of like, there's too much going on. I can't even ask my husband to step in so I can take a little time. And he would be so upset if he heard that, because like he wants to step in, right? He wants to help, and that's hard. And I think that's a lesson for all of us, is like, how do we ask for help and how do we tell people what we need? And that's just a critical thing. So, all right, I want to jump to some questions because it's 30. Get excited though for that live stream we're going to have soon with Jeff. We will bring him in, and it will be so fun. And it will be really a chance for us to dive into good and bad of ERP, but really the purpose of ERP. How do you build exposures? It'll be focused a lot for professionals and clinicians and how to do ERP with your patients, but of course for patients to attend to. With that being said, as always, when we hop into questions now, this is not intended to replace treatment. This is intended to be educational and supportive. And if, of course, you're in crisis or feeling suicidal, please call 988-911 or go to your local emergency room. Lots of live streams coming up. We have amazing programming this new year. Please go to iocdf.org/peace of mind, where you can put comments, questions about what you want to see, but also learn more about any of our upcoming events and what we have going on. Last and final plug that I'm feeling anxious about today is that all of the conference submissions are due at the end of this month. And so if you want to submit to present at the conference and you want to present on OCD, you want to present with other individuals with OCD, with professionals, whatever you want to do, please take a look at our programming and past programming to see the types of talks that exist and consider putting together a proposal. One thing we love is new faces and new content. Our goal across the board is that the conference is a way to engage with our entire community and to really connect and provide information and education on topics that aren't necessarily readily accessible. And we would love for you to be a part of that. So whether you're an individual, a family member, or a professional, you absolutely can apply to present at the conference, and we would love for you to do so. Go to iocdf.org for more information. Proposals are due end of this month. So end of January is when you have to have your proposal submitted. I know Chris and I and others are already texting and kind of starting to panic about it. And I was like, I didn't want to think about this yet and have to do those, but I get it. So it's on our radar. Let's hop in. I want to start with Kylie's question at 10:42 my time. Chris, I'm really struggling with BDD. I feel like there's no hope in getting better. It doesn't seem possible. Any advice? I was good for a long time, but now I'm worse than I've ever been.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Kylie. A couple immediate thoughts pop up for me. The first is whenever a client comes to me and says, I was doing really well for a period of time and now I'm doing worse, the two things I like to look at is, was there an event when you talk about things got worse? Because as we know, sometimes when we have life stressors or events, our general anxiety gets worse and our BDD or OCD kind of social anxiety latches onto general anxiety and says, look, do these compulsions, they'll get your anxiety down, and giving back into that. So sometimes I like to look at that. If there was no stressful event, the other thing I like to look at is if you say you've been doing good for a long time, what are those things that you were doing that were really helpful? Did you reduce those? Do we need to alter those, et cetera? So sometimes clients will say, well, I was doing really well because I was doing my work and I was also had a job in school, and now I'm kind of taking some time off of that. And I have been giving up my treatment. It's like, okay, well, let's get those things back. The big thing, though, I wanted to approach you with, Kylie, is one question I have for all my clients with BDD is I ask them, what are their treatment goals or what are they hoping comes out of treatment? And a lot of times people say, well, I'll get better if I like how I look. And I'm like, okay, that's not necessarily the goal. That's one of the awesome things that comes from treatment. But what I'm really trying to do, Kylie, so if you're my client, et cetera, I'd say what I'm trying to get you to do is let's look at all the things that you have now given up in your life because of your appearance. So a lot of people will have given up dating or classes in person or a job. They might work virtually, or they might not FaceTime their friends, or they take themselves off social media, or they're looking at plastic surgery, et cetera. And I say, okay, the BDD has convinced you that your appearance has to be perfect in order for you to engage in those things in life. What I can promise you is your appearance is not the problem. It's the way you're reacting to your thoughts about your appearance that's the problem. So let's try that. Let's see what it would be like to date or go back to school or go back to work or post on social media. Let's see if those things that BDD has kind of conned you into believing are true, because my guess is it's sort of the fear of what might happen. Let's kind of see. And so as I have clients engage in those things, what they learn is their appearance isn't this magic ticket. There's not like a level of their appearance they have to get to and then they can engage. They look that they've been sort of holding themselves back because of the fear. And as you engage, Kylie, in those things, you'll see like, wait, I'm meeting friends, I'm out, I'm dating, things are great. Lastly, the goal of treatment is to get to a point where you learn how to respond differently to those thoughts and those feelings. But the mistake that people with BDD get trapped into is it's like, I'm going to get back in that mirror. I've got to convince myself I'm attractive, etc. So when you talk about no hope and getting better, ask yourself, what are you doing on a consistent basis on a day? Are you going out and making sure you order food in person, engaging with other people? And if you're pulling back and isolating, that's probably what's driven you back into this slump.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I just want to throw in there too that, remember, if we're waiting for the perfect time or to feel a certain way to engage with life, there's a chance we're never going to get back to engaging with life, right? The way we feel different is by starting to engage, right? So we actually want to go engage. We want to start redoing those things or re-engaging with those things that are important to us. And that is when we'll start feeling different. We don't feel different first. So anyway, lots of thoughts, but let's hop to 11:02 my time from Ro, and I'm going to combine both of his questions. Or him or her, sorry, but how to differentiate between something that really happened and something that my OCD tells me happened. How do I differentiate between real and false events in OCD? I'm having OCD the last 3 years. First I had hit and run and then pedophilia OCD, and now I'm suffering with permanations of harm OCD. How also can I stop changing the theme? So let's jump to both questions. So I think the first question is, how do you differentiate between a true event and an OCD event? And then the second piece is, how do we address themes changing? And they kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah, I would say for that first part, when I have clients come in and it's a lot of false memory OCD, or real events OCD that they'll have been at a party in college and they're now questioning, did I do something with the girl that I hooked up with that was inappropriate? Did I get, what I always ask them is, how are they coming to this conclusion? And if it goes back to, I always like going back to the basics. I remember we did a talk a long time, Liz, about taboo thoughts, and people were asking questions, and you're like, the best thing to do is go back to the basics. So is the way you've gathered your information that you've done this horrible thing in the past because you're having intrusive thoughts and unwanted images and unwanted feelings? Well, that's the very definition of OCD. You have your answer right there. So we're not using that as reassurance, but we're using that as recognition that this is an OCD event and you got to jump into the treatment. Because the mistake people make with real event and false memory OCD is they go on this like detective fact-finding mission. They try to recapture old memories. They try to replay things. Sometimes it's looking things up or asking people for information. So when I have clients come in the office, I'm like, how did you get to this conclusion? Did somebody approach you? Did somebody say something? Is there a picture that came out? Like, why now? And they're like, I don't know. I was watching TV and there was the Me Too movement. And then I thought about this party back in college and now I'm questioning myself. There's a lot of questions. There's a lot of what ifs. Those are a lot of ways that it's teaching you the OCD. So what I love about this subtype is really empowering that response prevention. All of that fact finding and mental compulsions and searching is actually the fuel that's keeping that engine running. And the most powerful thing you can do is take away your attention. And once you take your attention away from that, the fuel kind of dies out. And then you get clear that, okay, well, I only started thinking about this because I was triggered and now I'm having intrusive thoughts, the very definition of OCD.
Sorry you guys, I feel like I'm like in this weird space right now where I'm getting so excited with content of just like, oh, and we need to add, so I'm getting animated. But one of the things you said, Chris, that I just loved is you were just saying kind of like, okay, so you break it down and like, is there intrusive thoughts and what's happening? And one of the things I was thinking is I thought, oh, it's so interesting because when we're living with real event OCD, we think, oh no, this is different, right? Because something might have actually happened, or like there was an event that I actually engaged in. And I was just thinking how one of the common things I'll hear people say is like, but this is different, Liz, or this is different than another subtype of OCD. But is it? And so as you were talking, I was just thinking, wow, well, someone with scrupulosity also truly believes that they might have done something wrong or they might have offended God, and that like there was something that actually happened, and that like, oh no, there is some validity to this because the Bible maybe says this, and I could, how do I know how to interpret it for sure? When you think about contamination fears, like the fear of HIV, it still came from somewhere. Like you may still not want to contract HIV or may still have anxiety or whatever it might be, that then OCD takes a hold and it goes to all these extremes and has you do all these intense rituals. But the reality is that the original thought is often still rooted in something. But my bigger question as you were talking, Chris, is I kept thinking like, well, why does it matter? So even if So I had a relevant OCD situation that happened to me. This was I can remember it exactly, but it was about 3 years ago. I was skiing with my husband, and it was Christmas time, and we were kind of just resting and relaxing. I was laying down, and I had an intrusive thought around a previous patient of mine. And I immediately had this thought of like, wait, what if they told me something and I didn't do what I was supposed to do? Like I didn't appropriately report, or I did something wrong, or I made a clinical error or judgment. And the problem with relevant OCD is that we can't always remember exactly what happened, right? And so the reality is that I don't know for sure whether I made an error or not. Like I can't say, I can feel pretty confident I didn't. And I can feel pretty confident that like, oh, Liz, you're a pretty good clinician. And like, if you weren't sure, you would have sought supervision and you would have asked questions. Like I can feel pretty confident in that now. In the moment, I had no insight to feel that. I was like, no, I definitely probably made an error. Like I had to have an emergency therapy session. I remember crying in the bathroom of the hotel, and my husband like not knowing what was going on, and me calling my therapist and being like, I've done something so wrong, oh my gosh, you can't believe this, like because there was so much anxiety for me attached. But treatment was no different than my treatment is for scrupulosity OCD or for other OCD, because the treatment at the end of the day was being able to engage in some self-compassion of like, hey, like I believe that I'm a good clinician and I would do what's right, but like I guess I won't necessarily know for sure, and I won't be able to confirm or deny that. And at this point, there's nothing I can do except move on. Right. And that is what's really important, is that maybe I did make a mistake. I will tell you, and Chris will tell you, I'm not a perfect clinician. I can guarantee I've made mistakes, and I can guarantee I'll make mistakes in the future. Sure, I'd like to hope that they're never huge ones, but like I can't control that I'm never going to make a mistake, or I'm always going to do things exactly how I should. I will try to do so, right? But the reality is that you accept kind of the unknown that you don't have a choice around accepting anyways. No matter how much I ruminated on that situation, I engaged in reassurance seeking, I wasn't going to get the answer my OCD wanted. I wasn't going to get to 100% certainty. And so the treatment was being able to say like, oh, like, I don't know for sure what happened, and I'm going to choose to still live my life and not do anything about it and let that be unknown. That's terrifying in the moment. It's super easy for Chris and I to sit here and say, well, this is what you should do, because right now we're not dealing with it. Right. But the reality is that it is terrifying, but it is no different than other subtypes of OCD. And I just want to throw that out there, because I think sometimes any of us are the first to say like, oh, but this one's different, or but this trigger is real, or this trigger, right? But the reality is that they're all rooted in the same thing. It's the fear of the unknown and us trying to confirm or achieve certainty. Right. We want to be sure we didn't do something wrong. We want to be sure people are okay. We want to be sure things are safe. We want to be sure we didn't, right. And the reality is that life is actually about accepting the unknown and doing the best you can.
Yeah, one thing I always remind clients is the way that OCD tricks us into getting involved. And the one thing that you said that was good about his part two question is all those themes are the same, right? Like OCD has to latch on to things we care about, and it has to move on to different things as we get better, because it needs to stay relevant. And one thing I always remind clients is the way that OCD cons us is it thinks like, okay, it presents this doubt, right? So in your case, like this doubt about how you handled a client. Then it lies to you and says, okay, Liz, you're just going to look at the facts objectively, and then you're going to come to a conclusion. But it's not. OCD uses confirmation bias. So any possible thing that makes you think that you messed up, it's going to highlight, and anything possible that it is going to confirm that you didn't, it's going to kind of downplay or throw away. And so then it's throwing at you this data, see all these things that could have possibly happened. And then we come to the conclusion like, oh, I looked at it objectively and you're right, I did something horrible. Now it's time to freak out. When in actuality, all OC did was highlight the things that it needed to convince you so you'd be conned into it. And so I always tell people, like, don't do OCD's job for it. Don't you spend hours and hours in your head trying to confirm OCD's worst case scenario, because then you're going to walk away feeling worse and then become more desperate and do the compulsion. So it's really about taking your energy away from what OCD is asking you to do. So a lot of these things, when it's past events, is trying to get in your head to replay. You don't have to do that. You can abandon it, walk away, and it feels so irresponsible, but it's actually the best thing for you.
That's right. It is the best thing for you. And remember, right, the second caveat is that while it feels irresponsible, while it feels terrifying, I can promise you, and Chris can promise you, you will have more insight and you will have more clarity that like, this was OCD, this was ridiculous after. You're not going to have it in the moment, but afterwards, right? So now I can look back and I can even talk about that situation with my patient freely, where like when it was in that moment, there is no way I could have even talked about it, right? It was so triggering. It was so overwhelming to me. And so it's really about giving yourself time and grace, and let's see if we're able to change our relationship with these thoughts, right? And we do it by actually approaching them. Matt at 11:12, I'm just reading this because this is why we do this work, right, Chris? It like makes us so
I know,
excited.
it made me smile too.
Makes us smile, but he just said he wants to say a massive thanks. He opened up to his family about OCD, and they were completely understanding and supportive. And I think we talked to you, Matt, at the last live stream and gave feedback on disclosure and what that might look like. So I just love this. It makes my heart so happy. And the thing I'll say, Chris, I'd love for you to add is that I do find that more often than not, people are much more compassionate than we expect. I think so many times we think no one's going to understand, no one's going to care, no one's going to be there. And I say more often than not, do people come back and say, actually, they really were receptive and they really supported me. We don't expect 100% support. We don't expect 100% that everyone is going to be, but at least that some are. And it just makes me happy to think that there's still good, loving people in this world.
Agreed. I'm happy for Matt.
Yes. So one of the things that was said by Kay Lai at 11:14 my time, Amanda, is good topic. I've heard all too often individuals with OCD promoting ERP doesn't work for mental rituals. I mainly have mental rituals, and I've learned that that is not true. So I'll start and Chris can add, but thank you. I love reading this and want to push this and talk about this freely, because actually this is something that we hear a lot. So a lot of individuals, even that come to the foundation, they'll say, well, I deal with mental rituals and I looked online and ERP won't work for me. And that is absolutely a myth, right? We should do what would it be called? Factor myth.
Oh yeah.
Fiction. We should do that.
Factor fiction. Yeah.
Do like a factor fiction and have y'all just put a bunch of questions and we can say factor fiction and describe it. But yeah, absolutely fiction, right? We know that ERP works for all OCD, and almost everyone with OCD has some type of mental compulsions, and many people with OCD have majority mental compulsions.
Yeah, to add on to what Oella said at 12:15, it's loving ERP, and it does work, just like Kayla was saying about mental OCD. What I always talk to clients about is we got to learn when the O turns into the C, especially for more mental-based compulsions. Yeah, and so what I'll tell people is they'll say, "Oh, I've been obsessing all day." And I'm like, you can't obsess all day. OCD presents its nasty, let's say OCD presents a nasty message at 8. Let's say I wake up and OCD says, Chris, when you left the office yesterday, you didn't lock up and somebody broke in. That's the O, and the sort of the stress hormones that come with it. If I spend the next 3 hours before I get to the office in my head replaying if I locked the door, coming up with these horrible scenarios of how people broke in and my whole, all of the staff I work with, their stuff's going to be stolen, all that. That is now the C. Those are compulsions that I'm choosing to engage in. It doesn't feel like a C as much as like washing hands or praying does, but it's absolutely a C. And so when we recognize like, okay, what I'm doing is I'm ruminating, I'm mentally checking, I'm panicking, I'm getting in my head and playing it out and like listening to OCD and just going there, that's where my power lies. So I need to go back to the O. What did OCD say? I left the door unlocked. My answer should be, okay, well, when I get to work in 3 hours, I will have to trust that I'll be able to figure it out and fix the situation. And if not, I'm going to have to come up with a solution. But there's nothing I could do. I'm at home. I'm not at the office, and I'll get there in 3 hours and I'll see what happens. I'm no longer going to engage mentally. You could be right, OCD. You could be wrong. I don't know. It's not important to me to spend any more time on it. What you have to remember is rumination is just rehashing the same dirty bathwater over and over. Somebody without OCD would only start rethinking about something when they get new information. We don't get new information from OCD. We just stay with the same old information over and over until you get to the office. And then you lock the office and you're like, oh, well, thank you. I'm so glad I worried about it for 3 hours because it shows that I care. It's like, no, we got tricked by OCD again. So I like that people are recognizing like, no, the treatment absolutely does work. It's just you got to recognize what you're doing in your head. And that's where the response prevention, the exposure work comes in.
Totally. And I love what you just said of like, we really need to be able to find the continuum of when does the O become the C, right? Because I think sometimes we muddy those a lot. And we really need to separate that out. That's so critical. Love, a lot of people are giving lots of love for ERP and talking about how it's definitely hard and sometimes it takes longer than you want, depending on certain themes or what you're working on, but that it really does work, and it's a great treatment tool. So love seeing this, love all of the feedback. I'm going. Barbara at 11:20 a.m. my time. Amanda, does your treatment work for hoarding disorder and anxiety disorder of OCD?
Yeah, so hoarding disorder, like you said, it's an OCD related disorder. So along with skin picking, hair pulling, and body dysmorphic disorder. And so hoarding disorder, the unique challenges that come with it is typically the person with hoarding. So I had a grandpa who hoarded, didn't see the same anxiety and stress that we see when we have OCD. Most of the stress came when us as a family try to throw things away. So typically it's when somebody's being contacted by the state that they need to clean up their area because it's causing, a disruption, or they're against some kind of housing code, or like family that are like, hey, I'm not going to bring your grandchild over because there's so much dust and dirt and things like that. So there is a lot of different components of hoarding treatment. You definitely want to make sure you find a clinician that specializes in it. So one thing that you're teaching the client how to do is to recognize their tendencies of hoarding. Why are they keeping items? Giving them some insight. So a lot of times clients will say, well, what if I need my tax returns from 1970? Or, this napkin, I had this napkin when I went on this trip and it's important to me. So it's learning that they don't need to hold on to these items. It's also teaching them how to organize. So there's a lot of great task forces that help people with hoarding to really organize their space. So it's teaching them how to organize, and then also teaching how to make sure not to hold on to things so that they start to be able to do it on their own. I think there's also sometimes like a lot of work about how to manage the anxiety, just like we do in our treatment. How do you manage the anxiety of giving things up? Because it's going to create a lot of tension and a lot of anxiety. And doing values work, is it important for your family to come over? It may be stressful to give up some of the items that you care about, but it's going to end up really helping. And then there's cognitive behavioral therapy work, like understanding what certain belief systems they're holding on to that are not serving them and causing a lot of distress. So a lot of us have been trained in it. There's a lot of trainings. I know the IOCDF has a specific hoarding track at the in-person conference. There's a lot of good work in that field as well.
I was looking behind to see if I had the book, but Buried in Treasures is a great book for hoarding disorder. And then, of course, you can go to iocdf.org. I believe we have an entire subsection on hoarding disorder. So anyway, I think that there's a lot of info, but I just want to kind of answer your question. Treatment absolutely works. It's a CBT based treatment, and there definitely is something that you can engage in, but it is not specifically ERP. So it looks a little bit different than the treatment model we're talking about. I know Chris and I and others have done some webinars as well on hoarding. So if you go to our YouTube channel, you can find those to watch as well. But lots of great content, and it's definitely something that we also approach and talk a lot about at the conference. Next question at 11:20. How can I learn that I'm being loved by God, and how to love myself if I experience massive emotional neglect and rejection through all of my childhood and teenage years?
Yeah, so it seems like two things might be going on here, Lucas. Is obviously one of the components of scrupulosity is a lot of questioning, like, does God love me? Am I doing the right things, etc.? And what I always remind clients is those are questions that will not be answered. There's not going to be a day that God comes down and says, I just want to let you know, Lucas, I love you, right? What we all do with our faith is we decide, like, what are those kind of like norms with our faith? What are those rules or those life lessons that we live by? Obviously, somebody who's Christian or Catholic is going to resort back to, or return back to the Bible for some of that guidance, or their priest or their pastor. And so a lot of what faith is believing in something without always having facts. And obviously we hate that with OCD, right? Like we want very concrete answers, but that's not always going to come with OCD. So that's part of it, is like trusting that, hey, like based off of the work that I do and the way that I live my life, it's in the same way. It's kind of like living in the same light of God. And therefore I know based off of just trust and faith that God loves me. But what's going on here second kind of seems like a little out of OCD scope. And it sounds like there's a lot of different trauma that you went through as a child with neglect and rejection through childhood. I don't know if it was either for, by your parents or by family or by peers. I know for me, in my own recovery journey, being gay, I dealt with a lot of rejection from friends, from teachers, comments from daycare providers, some from family, and some people of faith in my life. And so that was part of my own work beyond OCD, was just feeling like maybe some of my intrusive thoughts and some of my relationship OCD also stemmed in some of that neglect and rejection. So for me, having to do that work. So I think in this case, it's finding someone or a team of someone's to help you with the scrupulosity, but also to help you work through what sounds like very real neglect and rejection.
100%. So many questions. I'm going to try to jump through a lot of these, Chris, so that we can get to them. Lots of people saying, well explained, they love it. And there's a question about ego self-relate, are OCD and ego self-related to each other? Because when it happens to me, I feel like I'm in the most tragedy life ever. I don't know if you have some thoughts you want to share on this.
Yeah, so when we talk about ego self, that comes from more like Freud and psychodynamic therapy. But it's asking, like, when it happens to me, I feel like I'm in the most tragic life. I mean, what I always remind clients is, like, one thing about OCD, I always tell clients, like, at least just read the description of Hunger Games, because I always use that as an analogy. When you watch the movie or you read the book, when they're in the Hunger Games, there's never a moment that they're like bathing or sun tanning or like having a picnic. They're in this constant state of fear and danger and always looking over their shoulder. And there's a really good book by it's called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. I think it's Michael Sapolsky. He's a researcher out of Stanford. And he talks about, like, with OCD, when we're in this constant state of our fight or flight at some level throughout the day, our brain starts to think of us as kind of like this hunted animal in the wild, that we're always having to look over our shoulder and something bad is always going to happen. And we have to be on top of it. And pretty soon we're solely in that kind of survival mode. And because of that, it is really difficult to ever think that your life is going great. That's why the statistics, I think the statistic is in the 70% of people with OCD also will have some depressive disorder. And it's because our lives are transformed into this almost Hunger Games like state. So to answer your question, Moonchild, it's like, of course you're going to feel like your life is the most tragic and it's happening to you, and why you, and everything's falling apart, because OCD can do that. So that's why Liz and I are so passionate about what we do and about these streams and about the treatment, is because we want to get you back into a lifestyle which you recognize that you're not in the danger OCD says, so you can re-engage with things that you care about, so you get out of this like Hunger Games like state.
Totally. Yvonne at 1128, you said that you're feeling so overwhelmed with contamination OCD, your water heater flooded, and there's been plumbers and heavy machinery in and out. And I just want to say, like, I feel for you. It sounds like this is kind of a flooded trigger, right? In the sense that it's higher than what you were expecting and what you do. But sometimes what I'll say is life throws things at us that feel overwhelming and we're not sure how to do it. But I have total confidence that you're going to make it through this trigger. And I hope that, if possible, try to push a little bit wherever you can to be able to get some freedom. And what I mean by that is that sometimes when these things happen that are unexpected and we don't want, if we try to kind of quit resisting, like, oh, there's people coming out, what are they touching? I'm tracking everything they're doing. And we actually just kind of say, oh, well, it's already flooded, it's already contaminated, I'm just going to be here and live with it. You might get some freedom in the midst of this really difficult exposure. Love that, hearing about people self-care and focus. Next question, all eyes on P at 1132. Appreciate the live stream. I wanted to know if you can talk about navigating the stress in the beginning of treatment. How does weaning off medication work? So the first thing I want to say is that I wouldn't necessarily, oftentimes they're not going to necessarily recommend that you would wean off of medication at the beginning of treatment. A lot of individuals would say, like, let's go ahead and get started with treatment before you make changes to medication, unless medication is counter to OCD treatment. So sometimes individuals might be on medication that might not be recommended for OCD. So you definitely want to be working with your OCD specialist and a psychiatrist on timing around medication and what makes sense. I think it could be a lot. If you're on good OCD medication, it could be a lot to, like, get off your meds and start treatment all at once. The second piece is there is so much stress at the beginning of treatment, but I think this is where today's live stream started, is that Chris and I want y'all to focus so much on the greater good and motivating goals, because that will help push you through that initial kind of anxiety that happens at the beginning of treatment, the initial really difficult part. Once we get going and we're in treatment and active, it should start to lessen, right? That anticipatory anxiety should start to decrease.
Yeah, and the good thing I want to plug is the second question: how does weaning off medication work? If everybody wants to come back, we're not here next Wednesday at the same time because it's Research Roundtable with Kyle and Dr. Abramowitz. But the week after that, which I believe is the 18th, Wednesday the 18th at our normal 12 Eastern, we're actually bringing on a psychiatrist. So we've been saving all of your medication-based questions. I'm going to add this to the questions. So if you come back in 2 weeks, we'll be able, obviously Liz and I will still be here so we can answer your general OCD questions. We'll have a psychiatrist that can specifically answer your medication questions. So definitely be back in 2 weeks.
Absolutely. Michael, I love all of your comments, and you're right. It makes sense actually that what you need to do. It's difficult to do it, and that's why you're in treatment, right? So remember, we don't expect that we can just face our fears. It is easier said than done, but together with a good clinician, I hope that you'll get there. Nicholas, I love your question. I want to make sure we get to it right now at 11:39. Chris, running 2 peer groups for OCD, I've had people come to me for therapeutic advice. What's the best way to diffuse the situation, but also provide support as a non-provider?
Well, first of all, Nick, I just want to say awesome that you're running support groups for OCD. We do love peers getting back involved. So thank you for the work you're doing. Us clinicians can run groups, but only so many. I think being as upfront as possible to say, before I became a clinician and I didn't know I was going to be a therapist, I was actually there was a therapist running the support group, actually 2, but I was like the peer person in the group, kind of just giving lived experience. And one thing that I always did is I made it very clear that everything I was giving them was not coming from a clinical basis like I can now as a licensed therapist, but this is what worked for me. And I'm just trying to spout out kind of what helped with me or what I see help other people. But that's what I think the big difference is letting them know, like, this is what you've done. And also the purpose of the group. The group, when it's ran by clinicians, might be more of a treatment-based OCD support group. But when it's run by peers, it's supposed to be more of just like, I'm tired of feeling alone. I'm tired of feeling like I'm crazy. And I just want to know other people out there care, love me, and support me. So letting people know it's much more about support and less about clinical treatment. And what you can do, you have 2 options. Is one, if you ever want to bring on like a therapist as a guest to your group, they could answer those clinical-based questions. Or what you want to do is you want to, navigate them to iocdf.org/find-help to find a clinician and just let them know, like, hey, we're here to support, give advice, kind of let you know, like, this is what we did, but it sounds like you need specific clinical help. Let's get you to a therapist. So that's what I would strongly encourage. But authenticity and letting them know that they're not going to be disappointed. They're going to still get so much out of the support that they get from being around others.
Yeah, and I just want to throw out there really quick that this is something I dealt with for a really long time. I ran a lot of support groups, and before I was a clinician, I really struggled with people asking treatment advice and me not knowing what to do and actually it feeling really overwhelming. I also got myself in some tough situations early on where I would take phone calls and I would try to help people, but they would be in crisis situations and I really shouldn't have been managing that. And so I also want to give you full permission to have healthy boundaries and to be able to say, to know what your boundaries are, right? So like, I'm a peer support offering a support group, and this is really for us to come together and offer support, but treatment related questions really need to be saved for a provider. And so while I'm happy to discuss my own personal experience with ERP and like share how it worked for me, anything that's really specific to your treatment needs to be discussed with your provider. There's a lot of reasons why this is important, right? And you guys hear us even talking about how IOCDF is not a crisis hotline. We do that intentionally because we're not, and we don't want to give the illusion that if someone's in a crisis situation, we're going to be able to help navigate that. Like, we can't. That's not what we're here to do. And so you just want to be really clear and upfront. The second piece is I always recommend that peer support groups have a list of rules that you go over at the beginning of group and that you have people acknowledge and sign, and that talk a lot about that, right? How this isn't treatment. It's not intended to be treatment, and we're going to refer you to treatment providers for treatment. You could also work to create a great list of treatment providers in your area that you provide to them, because that's always really helpful and an easy way to say, like, I'm not a clinician, but here's a list of some clinicians you could look into working with. It is time to go. We're a little bit over. I'm sure Chris and others have meetings, but we love you guys. This has been so amazing. Any of the questions we didn't get to, Amanda will work to document that in our spreadsheet, and we will absolutely do our best to get to it soon. Next week, we are out because Research Roundtable will be right here at Wednesday of next week, Wednesday, January 11th at noon Eastern time. And then Chris and I will be back. We have a lot of exciting upcoming live streams, and we just want to keep serving you. So please make sure you go to iocdf.org/peace of mind to tell us what you want or what we're missing. Love you guys. So great to see y'all. Happy New Year. Be compassionate towards yourself and be excited about the year that's ahead. Chris?
Yeah, I'll just say real quick. So Matt gave us an idea of doing a talk on stigma OCD,
Yes.
DJ, IBG, about back to the basics was ERP. So we wrote those. I've been writing them down. I'm not texting friends. So we put those as upcoming topics. And then Michael, you asked a really good question about medication. So I put you on for the question. So be back in 2 weeks. We're going to do medication answers. The question about OCD and social anxiety and a couple other questions we didn't get to, I promised you I put them at the top of our pre-submitted question list. So we'll get to those. And then one of the last questions was about, do Liz and I still suffer with OCD? And what I would answer that is you're kind of on the way out. Liz and I have both done so much hard work that we push you guys to do because we know how much it works. And both of us live absolutely amazing and fulfilled lives that we're happy with and proud with. And I could say that we don't suffer anymore. Do we still deal with it? Do we still have to manage it? Do we still go to treatment, or do we still like use our tools? Absolutely. But I always tell people that my life used to be 99% OCD suffering and 1% living, and now it's the flip-flopped. And I hate traffic and taxes more than I do OCD at this point. So you too can get better. Keep coming to our live streams, and we'll see you in 2 weeks where we can talk about medication.
Bye, you guys. Love y'all.